Hi, and welcome to Psychology 1. I'm glad you remembered to be here for Memory Part 2. So, with the crowd chanting his name, Crosby, Crosby, a gold medal was slipped over Sidney Crosby's head and came to rest comfortably on his chest. Now, this was a fitting moment for the talented young hockey player from Cole Harbour in Nova Scotia, who scored the game-winning overtime goal against the American teams in the Olympic hockey team. And most of Canada erupted in a frenzy of emotion. Like Paul Henderson's goal of the century that was against the Russians in 1972, I remember that so well because we got time off of school to watch the game on TV. In fact, they had TVs in our classrooms to watch it in 1972. Crosby's goal would be remembered for many years to come by young and old hockey fans alike. The 2010 Olympics in Vancouver was a successful competition, with the medal count for Canada at 14 gold, 7 silver, and 5 bronze. The success of the Canadian athletes has been attributed to several things, including increasing funding for training prior to the events, the location of the games in Canada, and the support of the Canadian fans at the events, and cash incentives up to $20,000 for athletes who had gold medals. For professional hockey players like Sidney Crosby, who make $8 million a year, what possible motivation could another $20,000 be? However, for a young Canadian athlete like John Montgomery, he won the skeleton gold medal winner, and he's also a Georgian college graduate, who worked as a sales consultant and automobile auctioneer. $20,000 might be nearly half of a year's salary for him. So external motivating factors such as money are only part of each success story. One of roughly 2,600 athletes who participated in the Winter Games, they all have in common an internally motivated, intense desire to compete and to win their sport of choice. They all sacrificed years of their lives training both minds and bodies in order to compete at the Olympics. And in fact, internal motivations such as a strong desire to win and a sense of obligation to one's country and supporters, often fueled by strong emotions, can be more powerful than the strongest external motivation. Underlying each gold medal athlete's story, from the successful professional hockey player to the amateur skater, it's a mixture of internal motivations, supportive external motivations, and powerful emotions which combine into a record-breaking victory. So how about when our clock goes off in the morning? Do you jump out of bed, eager to meet the day? Or do you bury your head in the blankets, wishing it will pass? This is going to be part 1, and in part 1 we're going to focus on motivation, theories of motivation, primary drives, and social motives. Once you're at your job and on the campus or studying online, do you always do your best, or do you work just hard enough to get by? Are you genuinely happy? Do you sometimes feel worried or feel sad? In this chapter, we're going to explore the physical, the mental, and social factors that motivate behavior in areas ranging from eating to sexuality and achievement. We'll also explore emotions and how they are expressed, but that's for next week. So let's get started with motivation. The psychology of motivation concerns the whys of behavior, all of the processes that initiate, direct, and sustain behavior that will satisfy our physiological and psychological needs. Motives are hypothetical states that activate behavior toward goals. Motives may take the form of 1. Needs, 2. Drives, or 3. Incentives. We're going to start with needs, and there's 2 types of needs. There's physiological needs and psychological needs. Our physiological needs include anything that's necessary for our physical survival on this earth. Oxygen, food, and the likes. Whereas psychological needs include the needs of achievement, power, self-esteem, social approval, and a sense of belonging. Physiological and psychological needs differ. The psychological needs are not necessarily based on deprivation. Since our biological makeup is similar, we share similar physiological needs. Since we are influenced by our culture, our needs may be expressed in different ways. Learning enters into the psychological needs. Therefore, all learning can affect each individual a little differently. Needs give rise to the second element, which is drives, which arouse us to action. The physiological drives are the counterparts to physiological needs. The longer we deprive a drive, the stronger that drive tends to be. And then 3, the incentives, objects, persons, or situations viewed as capable of satisfying a need or as desirable for their own sake. For example, incentives could include money, food, sexually attractive person, social approval, and attention that can all act as incentives. Now, there are theories for motivation, and we're going to look at a few. Psychologists don't really agree about the precise nature of motivation. We'll start with the evolutionary perspective. Animals are naturally and neurally pre-wired to respond to certain stimuli in certain ways. Species-specific behaviors are called instincts or fixed action patterns. Instincts are genetically transmitted from generation to generation. William James and William McDougall argued that humans have instincts. They would describe or would label them as an instinct: love, sympathy, modesty, hunger, sex, and self-assertion. The question of whether humans have instincts is still unresolved. So we can't say with any certainty what anything that's we can hang a hat on, if it were. Now, the second theory we'll touch base on is what's known as drive reductionism and homeostasis. Primary drives trigger arousal. It creates a tension and it activates our behavior. We engage in behaviors that reduce that tension. These can include such things as hunger, thirst, and pain. Acquired drives are acquired through experience. We acquire, the drive for money because money isn't naturally something we are born to desire, but we learn that money has value. Social approval, we learn about social approval. Affiliation, these are all things that we learn over time. We're not born with an understanding of. Now, homeostasis, as I mentioned earlier, this is a steady state. Homeostasis, it's balanced. People are motivated to maintain a balanced or steady state. It works like a thermostat. When the temperature drops below a set point, the heating system is triggered and it will stay on until that set point is reached. Now, a search for stimulation, we can look at motives in this way. Stimulus motives, the organism is motivated to increase stimulation, not reduce the drive. Lower animals and humans appear to be motivated to seek novel stimulation. Now, novel stimulation just means things that are new. Stimulus motivation, it provides an evolutionary advantage. Animals that are active and motivated to learn about their environment are more likely to survive. We'll touch now on the humanistic theory. Now, Abraham Maslow was instrumental in the humanistic theory. He believed that people are motivated by the conscious desire for personal growth. Now, you're familiar perhaps with his hierarchy of needs, in that he would go on to argue that people will tolerate pain, hunger, etc. to attain personal fulfillment. Now, the top part of that triangle is what's known as that top component is self-actualization, and it's defined as that self-initiated striving to become whatever we believe we are capable of being, the best of our best for ourselves. As vital in humans as hunger is, Maslow's hierarchy of needs ranges from the physiological, which is those base needs, such as hunger, thirst, through to the top, self-actualization. Now, we naturally strive to climb the hierarchy, from physiological to safety to love and belonging, easy for me to say, esteem, and then self-actualization. Now, critics argue that there's too much individual variation for the hierarchy of motives to apply to everyone. So if we're going to look at evaluating the theories of motivation, drive reduction theory may explain why we drink when we're thirsty. Stimulus motives might explain why we drink alcohol and attend social events. Self-actualization motives could explain why athletes sacrifice their time and resources when training for competitions. And what we'll do is we're going to look at hunger as our first example. So let's move to hunger, and we'll explore motivation as it relates to that. Now, the importance of food, necessary for survival, symbol of families' togetherness and caring. We associate food with nurturance of the parent-child relationship. The biological influences on hunger, well, they satisfy or satisfaction. We get these signals from our digestive tract and also from our mouths, from chewing and swallowing. Hunger pangs are our stomach contractions letting us know that we need something in there. A ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, that's the stop eating center of the brain. Research with rats have shown that when destroyed, the rats continue to eat and become hyperphagic. When stimulated, the rats stop eating. The lateral hypothalamus is the start eating center of the brain. When destroyed, the rats may stop eating altogether. Aphagic. I practice some of these words, and then when I get going, I forget what I just practiced. I didn't do enough rehearsal. That's an example from our memory section. When stimulated, the rats started to eat, and so that's the significance of the start eating center of the brain. The psychological influences of hunger, well, other factors that influence hunger include the sight or aroma of food. Anxiety or depression can trigger that interest, and so can boredom. We have a funny and interesting relationship with food. One of the side effects of loving food too much is the potential for obesity, or a serious and pervasive problem. Some facts about obesity. You can check out the data that you find in your text on page 217. North American culture idealizes the slender heroes and heroines. People who are obese may encounter several health-related problems, including hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, gallbladder disease, osteoarthritis, sleep apnea, respiratory problems, and certain kinds of cancer. They may also have and live shorter lives. Now, factors in becoming overweight, well, there's biological factors that can influence overeating, and one is hereditary. Overweightness, if that's a correct word, it tends to run in some families. Fatty tissue also metabolizes food more slowly than muscle does. Dieting slows down the metabolic rate, thus making it more difficult to lose weight. Fat cells. Average man, about 40% muscle, 15% fat. The average woman, 23% muscle and 25% fat. Some of the psychological factors that can involve observational learning. If you see other people eating, you might choose to eat too. Stress, emotional states, exposure through media to unhealthy food choices, situations such as family celebrations, watching TV, arguments, and tension all can affect our eating habits. Negative emotions such as depression and anxiety can lead to binge eating. There are different forms of eating disorders, and they're characterized by persistent, gross disturbances in eating patterns. 1.5% of Canadian women ages 15 to 24 suffer from eating disorders. Anorexic Nervosa is a life-threatening eating disorder characterized by extreme fear of being too heavy, dramatic weight loss, distorted body images, resistance to eating enough to maintain a healthy weight. It afflicts women predominantly during adolescence and young adulthood. White females of higher socioeconomic status. 6-to-1, a gender ratio with more females to males. When we consider some of the risks, well, general health deteriorates, and mortality rate is approximately 5%. Premature development of osteoporosis. So, may actually become preoccupied with food. We are looking through cookbooks, shopping for their family, preparing meals. It can be a very overwhelming element in people's lives, particularly where food and weight are a problem. Another form of eating disorder is what's known as bulimia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is characterized by recurrent cycles of binging and purging. Purging can include vomiting, strict dieting, fasting, the use of laxatives, and prolonged and excessive exercise. Tends to affect women during their adolescence and young adult years, and more European Americans. Origins to eating disorders, well, it's hard to determine. There's a great deal of research with many questions remaining and unanswered. Many parents are obsessed with getting their children to eat. Children may learn to resist their parents or to even punish them. Often the parents have issues with eating themselves. So some parents act out against their daughters, letting them know that they consider them unattractive and that they should slim down. And the family environment can be very negative as a result of all of this experience for all the participants. Now, typically, a history of child abuse and particular sexual abuse, exposure to high parental expectations. Now, there are some sociocultural features that can be influential here, and that slimness as the ideal is one of those things. In our fashion magazines, models tend to be 9% taller and 16% thinner than the typical woman. A BMI of lower than 18.5 is malnourished, and recent Miss Americas have come in at the BMI of 17. Now we're going to touch on another motivational area, and it's going to be sexual motivation. Now, sexual motivation may be natural, but it's strongly influenced by religious and moral beliefs and cultural traditions, folklore, and superstitions. What is considered normal depends on the society in which you live. Hormones and sexual motivation. Sex hormones fuel the sex drive. Testosterone replacement therapy increases the sex drive in males. Sex drive in women is also connected to testosterone levels. The most common sexual problem among women is the lack of sexual desire or interest. And sex hormones have activating effects. They affect the sex drive and promote sexual response. There was research done on female mice, and rats, cats, and dogs are receptive to males only during estrus, when females' sex hormones are plentiful. Now, sex hormones also have an organizing effect. They motivate lower animals towards masculine or feminine mating patterns, and may have implications with sexual orientation. Many may masculinize or feminize the brain by creating predispositions consistent with some gender role tendencies. Now, sexual response, men tend to show more interest in sex than women do. Women may want to combine sex with a romantic relationship. and there are similarities to the biological response of males and females to sexual stimulation. Masters and Johnson's, going back into the 50s, I think, 50s and 60s, the changes that occur, well, they were looking at sexual response cycle and the changes that occur in the bodies of men and women as they become more sexually aroused. Vasocongestion is swelling of the genital tissues with blood. It causes an erection of the penis and swelling of the area surrounding the vaginal opening. Myotonia is a muscle tension, causes the facial grimaces, spasms in hands and feet of the spasm of an orgasm. Erection and vaginal lubrication and orgasm are all reflexes. They all occur automatically in response to adequate sexual stimulation. The decision to enter a sexual relationship is voluntary. Phases of the sexual response cycle include excitement phase, plateau phase, orgasmic phase, and resolution phase. Details on these phases are in your textbook. Should you be interested in more clarification. The surveys on sexual behavior, well, Kinsey reports, a very famous group that made much research in the area of our sexual behavior. They report through the interviews with some 5,300 males and 5,940 females in the U.S. between 1938 and 1949, people were surprised to learn that the majority of males masturbated and engaged in sexual intercourse prior to marriage. Now remember the time frame, we're talking in the 1930s to the 40s. A significant minority of women engaged in these same behaviors. There's no way of knowing whether or not Kinsey's results accurately mirrored the general American sexual behavior at that time. They did find a positive link between the level of education and premarital sex. A recent government-sponsored study of Canadian youth tells an interesting story about sexually active teens in Canada. 1 in 5 grade 9 students report having sex at least once. The number increases to 1 in 4 for grade 10 students. It's consistent with data from adults. Canadian teenage boys report having a greater number of sex partners than teenage girls. The majority of Canadian high school teens are still choosing not to have sex. Reasons given for not having sex by grade 9 students include not feeling ready and wanting to be a virgin until marriage. Now, sexual orientation is a very big subject matter. There's a whole course. I teach a course on gender studies entirely on just gender and sex. Sexual orientation. The heterosexual orientation is the sexual attraction to people of the other sex. That's heterosexual. Homosexual orientation is an attraction to and an interest in forming romantic relationships with people of their own sex. And then, of course, bisexual people are attracted to both females and males. Sexual orientation differs from sexual activity. Now, this is an incomplete list when we look at sexual orientation. However, there is a whole course, like I said, where we look at and explore in more detail sexual orientations. The origins of sexual orientation. Well, the Canadian Community Health Survey from 2017 found that 1.3% of men and 0.7% of women in Canada identified themselves as homosexual. Survey also revealed that 0.6% of men report being bisexual sexual orientation, whereas 0.9% of women do. Now, learning theorists, they look at the roles of factors for such as reinforcement and observational learning to explain some of that data, if you will. Reinforcement of sexual behavior with members of one's own sex. Critics suggest that individuals may become aware of their sexual orientation before engaging in any sexual activity. Research continues exploring possible links between orientation and sex hormones, prenatal hormone levels, and maternal stress. Much about the development of sexual orientation remains very speculative. Now we'll touch base on achievement motivation. Striving to get ahead, to make it, to invent. Assessment of motivation. Henry Murray developed a thematic appreciation test, or the TAT. The TAT contains cards with pictures and drawings that are subject to various interpretations. The subjects are to construct stories about the pictures that they see. Often these constructed stories can reveal various levels of achievement motivation. Extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations, as I mentioned in the introduction. Tangible awards can serve as incentives for maintaining good grades. That's the extrinsic. Related to performance goals, these incentives work better when students look upon incentives as signs that they are intelligent and capable. Learning goals tend to be related to more of an intrinsic motivation, understanding and enhancing your knowledge, satisfaction with self. Parents can help children develop learning goals by showing warmth and praising them for their efforts to learn, exposing them to novel and stimulating experiences, and encouraging persistence. Many of us strive to meet both performance and learning goals, and that's covering essentially achievement. Now, this is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the semester, this is a survey course, so a lot of what we're getting is bits and pieces and light description of some of the important issues in psychology. Each of these chapters essentially is a study of psychology where you could take an entire course in. So I know this was kind of on the brief, but I hope it was helpful for you. Good luck, everybody, and in part 2, we're going to look at emotions. Bye now.